Go ahead, Minister.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, the 2021-22 fiscal year central government and public body budgets have been formulated around the continuing global and local impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and the efforts to counter its spread and restore higher levels of economic activity. The COVID-19 pandemic generated both a health crisis and an economic crisis during the current financial year 2020-21. The pandemic has impaired the health of thousands of Jamaicans, strained health systems, and led to the reduction of economic activity across Jamaica, including the virtual shutdown of the tourism sector for much of the year. This translated into a significant loss of revenue for the government and, simultaneously, to the need for new expenditure to address the health consequences while cushioning the social and economic impact. The hit to the revenues in financial year 2021 is estimated at an unprecedented decline of 11.3% or $73 billion as compared with 2019-20. Despite this, Madam Speaker, overall expenditure increased by over $24 billion as compared with 2019-20. To enable the government to pursue the required expenditure in the face of the unprecedented revenue fallout, the government requested and obtained suspension of the fiscal rules following amendment of the Financial Administration and Audit Act that included an adjustment in the target date for attainment of the debt target. The Financial Audit and Administration Act requires that in periods following suspension of the fiscal rules, corrective action in the form of a constraint on the fiscal balance is taken to restore the trajectory for the achievement of the debt to GDP target. This corrective action has been applied in developing the 2021-22 central government and public body budgets. Madam Speaker, under our fiscal responsibility framework, it is a requirement that a budget is passed before the beginning of the fiscal year to which it applies. That is by March 31st of each year. It is also a requirement that the Auditor General and soon the Independent Fiscal Commission reviews the budget for compliance with the fiscal rules prior to its consideration by the Standing Finance Committee of Parliament. These two requirements together make it necessary to table the budget at this time each year to be followed 3 weeks later by the opening budget presentation by the Minister of Finance. The budget is presented in a rigid format, Madam Speaker, that conforms to international best practice chart of accounts for public finance. It is not presented in a policy framework. As a result, it can be difficult to decipher the policy intent of the government from a perusal of printed accounting entries. For this reason, since this timetable change took effect, it has been necessary to offer a few editorial remarks at the time of the tabling of the budget. Furthermore, at this unprecedented time when Jamaica is in the grip of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact, the public interest is best served by the people of Jamaica having an understanding as early as possible of the policies and programs planned for the upcoming fiscal year. While I may be taking attention away from the budget speech, I outline some facts that I think are important for the public to be aware of at this point in time. This budget, Madam Speaker, follows a year in which Jamaica experienced the worst economic contraction in its history due to measures required to slow the spread of the coronavirus. Inclusive of the January to March quarter, by the end of March, we will have experienced 5 consecutive quarters of economic decline. And of course, we lost $73 billion in revenues. In previous downturns, economic contractions have lasted several years in a row. In the global financial crisis that began in 2008, for instance, the economy declined for 3 consecutive years and 11 out of 12 quarters. In the 1970s, we experienced 5 consecutive years or 20 quarters of economic contraction from 1976 to 1980 inclusive. From the very outset of this economic crisis, we positioned ourselves to absorb the shock and to recover faster and stronger than we have before. We have made public our intention to recover quickly, and this informed the commissioning of the COVID Economic Recovery Task Force, its deliberations and report. Our task this year is to begin the economic recovery, and we aim for economic recovery to begin this upcoming fiscal year, and furthermore to begin this upcoming April to June quarter. Of course, yes, of course we're not in control of all variables, but that certainly is the policy intent. Our budget, Madam Speaker, within the strictures with which we have to operate, and to the greatest extent possible, is aligned with this objective. Make no mistake about it, Madam Speaker, this is a dangerous economic crisis, and the wrong choices could prolong and deepen its effects. On the positive side, however, the path out of this crisis is clear, but it is a very narrow path. Meaning, Madam Speaker, we cannot do everything. We have to prioritize, and we have to prioritize within priorities. And we have to be very strategic and deliberate in what we do. Our priorities for recovery include: 1, we need to ensure that we make adequate provisions for vaccines. For economic recovery, it is essential that the financing exists for Jamaica to procure sufficient vaccines to reach herd immunity with respect to the coronavirus in the quickest possible time. Madam Speaker, we need to ensure that we bolster social support to assist the vulnerable persons and those who are most affected by the pandemic. Madam Speaker, we need to continue to finance the provision of the public goods and services on which our society and economy depends. And Madam Speaker, we need to maintain stability in the economy, and we need to ensure that the foundations of economic and job recovery are laid right now, Madam Speaker. Those are among our priorities. Now, I want to say a few remarks on the stability imperative. Due to this crisis, our debt is now at 110% of GDP. We have been here before at least twice, once on the way up and another on the way down. This time, however, Madam Speaker, it is important that we steer clear of the edge of the precipice with which we have painful familiarity. Any kind of instability would greatly magnify existing challenges. At a minimum, we have to ensure that we cover our interest costs, which constitute a major component of our non-discretionary expenditure, from our own revenue. This means, Madam Speaker, we have to reserve $125 billion of our revenue to pay interest. With the approval of Parliament, we suspended the fiscal rules in this fiscal year, and hence this requirement we never needed to abide by. But we were greatly aided by the fact that we had a substantial cash balance to draw on, averting the need to borrow to pay interest. Not covering interest from revenue again this year would mean that we would need to borrow to pay our interest bill, which, given the elevated debt levels at 110% of GDP, which shot up by 15 points in one go from 94, it could quickly put us again on an unsustainable path, with adverse implications for jobs, for investment, for interest rates, inflation, and other economic variables. complicating recovery efforts. And Madam Speaker, nobody wants that. Madam Speaker, the expected continuation of the impact of the pandemic on Jamaica during the 21-22 year, as well as a fiscal balance constraint that we have, has limited the government's ability to commence implementation during the upcoming fiscal year of the compensation restructure arising from the comprehensive compensation review undertaken over the last several years. The government, Madam Speaker, is therefore seeking a one-year delay with respect to the commencement of the implementation of the compensation restructure, as the government focuses on facilitating Jamaica's recovery from the pandemic. We have undergone a thorough review and examination of public sector compensation, as we promised we would, and we have done it within the time frame that we promised we would, by December of 2020. But, Madam Speaker, given the massive impact of the pandemic, we do not have the resources to begin the implementation of the review and finance our recovery at the same time. Furthermore, it is critical, Madam Speaker, that whatever resources we can corral, we use this year on vaccines, the distribution of vaccines, and our social and economic recovery, inclusive of jobs and social support for those who have been hardest hit. Madam Speaker, unlike other countries, Jamaica's public sector has been largely shielded from the financial impact of the pandemic, thank God. There have been 130,000 job losses, certainly reported as at July 2020, some of which have been recovered, as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And none of them have come from the public sector, thank God. That is unlike other countries, including other countries in our region. So we ask for understanding, Madam Speaker, and for the continued patience and understanding of the public sector, of which we are all a part. And, Madam Speaker, very importantly, this includes all who are paid by the public purse and who are not necessarily unionized in a traditional sense, inclusive of all parliamentarians. We seek your understanding as well.
We show solidarity with the workers.
After factoring annual increments, which are a part of the cost of public sector compensation, a very, very modest increase in wages has therefore been programmed for 21-22, with the expectation that the compensation structure will commence in financial year 2022-23. So we're not coming and asking for a freeze. In addition to the increment, there'll be we are proposing a very, very modest increase that can be afforded within the context. And we will use this year, Madam Speaker, to fine-tune the parameters of the compensation restructure with the union movement so that we can move towards beginning implementation in the next financial year. Madam Speaker, as a result of the above factors that we've taken into consideration in preparation of the 2021-2022 budget, the central government plans to spend a total of $830.8 billion during the year, comprised of recurrent program expenditure of $247.8 billion, compensation of employees of $239.2 billion, capital expenditure of $54.2 billion, debt service of $272.2 billion, and loans to public bodies of $17.3 billion. Now, let me just make two quick comments on this. The first comment is that in our capital expenditure budget this year, normally the PATH program, which we began with World Bank assistance, has from inception been included on the capital side of the budget because it was a program financed by our external multilateral partners. That program has now ended, but we are continuing, obviously, the PATH program funded from normal revenues, and in keeping with the best principles of public financial management, the PATH program is no longer included on the capital side of the budget, but is in the recurrent side. So if you're to compare the capital budget with this year, a like-for-like comparison would have to make that adjustment. There was approximately $8 billion prior to the CARE program. So if you add the CARE program, approximately $10 billion of PATH program expenditure that was on the capital side of the budget in the current fiscal year. A like-for-like comparison would mean that if you're comparing with next year, the CapEx budget is more like $64 billion on a like-for-like basis. Just want to make that, so that is understood. The other point, Madam Speaker, is that though programmed expenditure for 21-22, program recurrent expenditure, program compensation expenditure, and program capital expenditure are all higher in the upcoming fiscal year, or all programmed to be higher in the upcoming fiscal year than this fiscal year, the total expenditure of $830 billion is lower than the $850 billion of this year. But before somebody run off and print headline, expenditure down, etc., please understand that that is as a result of lower debt service costs this year and lower volume of loans to public bodies this year than last year. The expenditure for recurrent activities, for capital activities, have increased year over year. The full program to be undertaken by the government, Madam Speaker, during the fiscal year 21-22 will be outlined during my presentation of the budget in March. There is one area, though, Madam Speaker, that I need to expand on today. The revenues that will finance this expenditure depend critically on a one-off dividend of $33 billion from the Bank of Jamaica, which we expect in the first week of April. Rarely, Madam Speaker, are the fruits of right and appropriate policy as powerfully evident in as short a period of time. Madam Speaker, after a long period of Bank of Jamaica losses, low profits, and high profit volatility, including a loss of $6.8 billion in just 2017, the Bank of Jamaica made a profit of $9.1 billion in 2018, $15.8 billion in 2019, and $9.9 billion in 2020. I have included in my presentation a table that shows Bank of Jamaica profitability over the last 10 years, and a graph that makes it quite graphic. The period that we are emerging from and the period that we are now in. Madam Speaker, the reversal of fortunes of the Bank of Jamaica resulted from the Bank of Jamaica modernization exercise and the deliberate and calculated and determined shift in monetary policy towards inflation targeting, which began in earnest in 2018 and away from the previous policy where exchange rate preoccupation biased policy towards excessive interventions, which ultimately have a hidden and non-transparent fiscal cost. Madam Speaker, I'll remind you, by the way, that this policy shift also paved the way for 10 consecutive reductions in the policy interest rate, all the way down to near zero, at 0.5%, and the expansion in credit that came from that. Now, you've heard me speak about this policy shift many times, but I've never spoken about it before in the context of the impact on the Bank of Jamaica and therefore the impact on the taxpayers of Jamaica. To make the point even more, to make it even clearer, Madam Speaker, in 2017, prior to this policy shift, the Bank of Jamaica reported $7.7 billion of foreign exchange losses. That's nearly $8 billion. The transfer of debt securities from the central government to the Bank of Jamaica that this Parliament approved in 2018-19 and 2019-20 to cover this and other prior year losses, which was also a part of the BOJ modernization exercise, also assisted in the improved BOJ performance. Now, I want to make it clear, Madam Speaker, that under the BOJ Act, it is a requirement by law. It is not a discretionary act. It is a requirement by law for the Bank of Jamaica to distribute dividends to the government whenever it makes a profit, and for the government to transfer resources to the Bank of Jamaica, typically debt securities, to cover Bank of Jamaica losses whenever they occur. Now, the Bank of Jamaica losses got so huge over that prior time period that various administrations were not in a position, or it was not a priority, to transfer debt securities to make up for those losses. As a part of the modernization exercise, as I mentioned before, that's what we did. So, even though the picture began to change in 2018 with the Bank of Jamaica now moving from losses into making profits, dividends cannot be paid on profits unless, what the law says, the law currently, because the new act is not yet in effect. The law currently says when the BOJ makes a profit, it pays a dividend. It has to pay a dividend to the government on the realized profits. When it makes a loss, the government transfers resources. But because the BOJ made these huge losses going back from 2010 coming forward, and the government had not paid over to the BOJ, it carried on its books a receivable from the government, even when the situation began to change and dividends were due, it would not have been practical to pay the dividends connected with the 2018 and 2019 profits, as the government still owed the BOJ on the previous losses. And hence, they're only available to be paid now, given that we have made up for the past losses. Now, I'll have more to say about this in the opening budget presentation, but let me say at least a few words now. That dividends from the central bank to the government are the natural order of things, albeit not on this scale, because this is cumulatively 3 years. A central bank is not designed to be a drag on taxpayers with consistent losses. I have some graphs I'm going to share. A central bank is not set up to bear non-transparent FX losses as a matter of course. The central bank is not designed to allocate subsidies through losses, as it is utterly non-transparent. Totally non-transparent. You can't say who benefits. On the contrary, a sovereign nation central bank is designed to make profit and for the profits to be transferred to the government for a transparent allocation in the democratic budgetary process. That is the scheme of things. Now, just a few things to note, Madam Speaker. I just want to make it clear that only maybe 20% of the dividend relating to the period 2018 to 2020 arises from foreign exchange gains from the Bank of Jamaica. The vast majority, over 80% of it, is from normal BOJ operations. The second thing is, when the Bank of Jamaica Amendment Act comes into force, the dividend regime will be updated. BOJ dividends will not be paid if its capital at the end of the financial year is less than 5% of monetary liabilities. And monetary liabilities are, notes in circulation, money issued, etc., and have a relationship with the size of your economy, your GDP, essentially. So even if it makes a profit during that year, if you're below 5%, at the end of the year, a dividend wouldn't be paid. Now, it should be noted, Madam Speaker, that before paying this dividend, we were way above that threshold. So that principle would be honored. And after paying this dividend, the central bank is projected to have its capital be 5% of monetary liabilities during this year, 2021. So the principle, Madam Speaker, that principle of attaining 5% is kept. Now, the BOJ Amendment Act, which I'll speak to more about later, cannot come into effect, just in case there are any cynical voices, it cannot come into effect until we have identified the appropriate persons, right, with the requisite levels of skills who have no conflict. You saw how I rushed that bill, right? It wasn't, I'm not going to, I didn't rush that bill. Huh? I know, but it wasn't me slowing it down, okay? Not me. So you have to have persons with the requisite levels of skills and who have no conflict to discharge the functions of the boards and the statutory committees of the BOJ as envisaged under the Act. And we're working hard to have that occur as soon as possible. And hopefully I'll be able to give an update in the budget presentation in March. But I'll just share, for example, the distributions of central banks. I have some graphs. I don't know if they've been distributed. Just so that we understand what the norm is, I want, that just sharing, for example, central banks in New Zealand and Canada and the UK and the United States. How many of them? I thought that okay. And what you'll see from these graphs, the first graph shows the remittances from the Federal Reserve, the central bank in the United States, to the United States Treasury every year. And you'll see that every year the Treasury remits in US dollars 40 billion, 80 billion, 90 billion, 100 billion. Clearly, their economy is much larger. But what I'm just trying to establish here, that this is the norm. What we have been observing before the modernization exercise has been abnormal. Okay? So you see here, every single year, profits being transferred from the Federal Reserve to the US government. You see the same headline in the Wall Street Journal: Fed sent 88.5 billion in profits to the US Treasury in 2020. You look at the Bank of Canada, every single year, the Central Bank of Canada making profits. And those profits, right? You see the Bank of England, every single year, profits. The Bank of New Zealand, with the exception of 1 year, every single year in the last decade. Okay? So what the period that we're engaged in here with the modernization exercise is the expectation is that the BOJ is profitable as a matter of course. As a matter of course. And that is a reason for the modernization exercise. I couldn't spell everything out, right? I took a lot of licks for it. I took a lot of hits for it, and a lot of criticism. But see the benefit here now? Madam Speaker, the central bank will pay a one-off dividend of $33 billion in the first week of the next financial year straight to the consolidated fund. The government's policy of BOJ modernization is literally paying dividends, Madam Speaker, at a time when we need it most. $33 billion. Billion with a B. Now, Madam Speaker, it's important that we all recognize that this level of dividend, which is 3 years at one time from the central bank, is not going to be repeated at that level on an annual basis. But we are expecting dividends to be the norm. So therefore, we can't treat it as a recurring source of revenue. Okay? So it has to be aligned with one-off level of activities. And thank God that we have it. Because when you look at the estimates of expenditure, you take $33 billion from it, and you tell me what you would cut out if you never had it. You tell me what you would remove if you never had it. But the lesson, Madam Speaker, the eternal lesson, is that the right and the appropriate policy, even if it is difficult in the short term, ultimately delivers for the people of Jamaica. So, Madam Speaker, the one-off BOJ dividend of $33 billion will facilitate a $60 billion social and economic recovery and vaccine program for Jamaica. Madam Speaker, the $60 billion Serve Jamaica program, social and economic recovery and vaccine program, the Serve Jamaica program, will consist of the following elements. Madam Speaker, $10.5 billion in special resources for the Ministry of Health. This is, I'm not talking about the Ministry of Health normal allocation. I'm talking about what we could finance because we have this policy dividend. Madam Speaker, $6 billion for vaccines. Let me say it again. $6 billion for vaccines, $1 billion for PPEs, $1 billion for drugs and reagents, and Madam Speaker, very importantly, and the reason why it's important, these are real live issues and it's important that this knowledge is known. $2 billion for regional health authorities. The nature of the COVID pandemic, Madam Speaker, is that the Minister will tell you, it causes it causes expenses to arise in ways that you wouldn't expect. You have more catering, you have more cleaning, you have more security, you have more services. And the providers of these services, as the Minister will tell you, are often small businesses. And the bills are ramping up. So this $2 billion special allocation to the regional health authorities will help, Madam Speaker. And $500 million for additional COVID-related expenditure, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, very importantly, based on the current prices and supply that the Ministry of Health has, we are making provisions for the government of Jamaica to be able to finance the procurement of and the completion of coronavirus vaccination for 2 million Jamaicans whether it's double dose or single dose, depending on the supplier, Madam Speaker. So 2 million Jamaicans out of a population of 2.7 or 3 million, Madam Speaker, is over 60%. That is, Madam Speaker, the government will allocate funds under the Serve Jamaica program to make the attainment the possible attainment of herd immunity in a single fiscal year fiscally feasible. The rest is up to the availability of supply, the logistics and distribution, all of which the Minister of Health will soon address. Madam Speaker, the Serve Jamaica program will allocate $31.1 billion to an infrastructure program to drive jobs and economic activity, improve productivity, and strengthen resilience.
That's right.
Consisting of $17.7 billion for the South Coast Highway Improvement Project. Now, it's important to understand the highway project is linked to a loan. But the way government finances occur, it's the expenditure that we have to be able to accommodate within our envelope. And if there are no revenues that can support the expenditure cannot come in whether you have the loan or not. So this dividend, this level of expenditure
Member, I just want to remind you that time is running. I know under the standing orders you have time to speak on a motion, but as you stop to explain, we are running time.
So 17.7 billion for
that you are speaking on a motion and you do have time, but time is running against you now as I see you stopping to explain, and I'm looking at this presentation in front of me. So your time is running short.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will soon be wrapping up. So 17.7 billion for the South Coast Highway, Madam Speaker. $8 billion in a special public investment infrastructure program to improve productivity and increase resilience with the installation of drains, widening and dualization of major thoroughfares, construction of sidewalks, etc. And this is captured in the contingency provision for the public investment management system under the allocation to the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service. The Serve Jamaica program will deliver $3.7 billion in secondary roads, repairing roads across Jamaica. Madam Speaker, the Serve Jamaica program will deliver $1.2 billion for the Montego Bay bypass and $500 million for the construction of new police divisional headquarters in Westmoreland and a new forensic pathology suite. This is on top of what's already in the budget. Now, Madam Speaker, through a special effort, this represents the largest programmed allocation to physical infrastructure on tabling of the budget by the government at any time in the past, Madam Speaker. It's a historical allocation to physical infrastructure designed to promote jobs and economic recovery. And this is pure infrastructure and not mere capex. Madam Speaker, the Serve Jamaica program will provide $5 billion in targeted assistance, targeted financing for businesses that are affected by the pandemic. It will deliver $1.7 billion for rural farm roads and productivity incentives for agriculture. Madam Speaker, it will deliver $1.8 billion to expand Wi-Fi and broadband in schools and communities. Madam Speaker, the Serve Jamaica program will deliver $8.1 billion in targeted social support above and beyond what is usually provided, which will be targeted to the vulnerable and those who have fallen on hard times as a result of the pandemic. $6 billion of this amount is captured under the Ministry of Finance and Public Services allocation. There's 0.7 billion to the UDC and $0.8 billion to other MDAs. Madam Speaker, a total of $59.7 billion dedicated to our social and economic recovery and vaccines for Jamaica, the Serve Jamaica program. Now, Madam Speaker, I wish it could be bigger. I wish it could be 100 billion, 200 billion perhaps. But this isn't possible without what we have come to call running with it, or racking up debt that we cannot sustain, and punishing the poor and the vulnerable with the consequences, or by stopping the provision of certain services by the government, both of which would be undesirable. Madam Speaker, the Serve Jamaica program will provide the foundation for social and economic recovery beginning in the upcoming fiscal year. It will finance the procurement of vaccines required to keep us safe and healthy that are essential to our social and economic recovery. It will finance record spend on infrastructure to drive jobs and economic activity, improve productivity and strengthen resilience. It will finance social support for the vulnerable and those who are most affected by the pandemic. It will finance an improvement in digital connectivity and Wi-Fi in schools and communities. The Serve Jamaica program will finance and support businesses, including agriculture, to boost the production that will be the foundation of our recovery. Madam Speaker, the budget, Madam Speaker, the Serve Jamaica program will assist in Jamaica's recovery. And Jamaica will recover. And Jamaica will recover stronger. Thank you.